What nobody had told me about was Corry Vreckan, which is the third largest whirlpool in the world. And of course, if I'd known about that, I probably wouldn't have made the journey in the first place. But what do they say? They say ignorance is bliss. I've had 9 boats, and when I got my first boat, I didn't know anything about boats at all. The sharp end, I didn't know what that was called, which is the bow obviously. The stern, the blunt end, I really didn't know a thing about boats. And the only reason why I bought a boat was I was living in the Highlands, and there's very little work up there. I went initially to make a film of the building of the Nevis Range ski development, and that was highly paid for about 12 months. But after the development was finished, money dried up. There was nothing to keep me up in the Highlands for, unless I could find a job that could give me a decent living. So with it only being fishing and tourism, I decided that I would have a go at becoming a fisherman. And so in 1991, I went down to a little place on the west coast of the Highlands called Westloch. There was a fella had just died, and his widow was selling his lobster boat. It was an old 19 feet lobster boat, an open boat, a little 2-cylinder Lister Petter engine, very, very basic and very rough, but it had a license and it was quite cheap. It was a good price for what it was. And so I decided to take the project on to become a creel fisherman. So the first time I ever actually been on a boat on my own was when I had to sail the boat up from Westloch Harbour to Fort William, which is about 100 miles, and that in itself was something of an adventure. I head off up the Sound of Jura, and between Jura and Scarborough is about a half-mile gap where the Atlantic really pushes through, and it's about 1,000 feet deep in there. And of course, what causes the vortex is a huge pinnacle, hundreds and hundreds of feet below the water. You obviously don't see it, but you do see the effect of what that does to the tide when it comes in, which is a huge, huge whirlpool. Well, it's sucked some rather big boats down in its time. It's a massive force, and leaves me completely unaware in this little putt-putt, chugging along, sailing along there, quite happy. And I wondered why things were starting to get a little bit bouncy, and then very bouncy, and I started to panic a little bit. I could see there were bubbles coming from all directions, so I didn't know what to do. I tried not to panic, of course. It was the first thing I tried not to do. And what I did do, I put the engine on full power, and I was praying and hoping that it wasn't gonna blow up, which fortunately it didn't do. And I eventually got away from the bubbles and the roar and the noise, and I still was completely unaware of what the problem was. But what I discovered later, much later, was the fact that I'd hit that on slack water. Now, if it had been an hour either side, I would have been bubbles, and it would have taken me down the boat and everything. But it was probably the second most scared I've ever been in my life, and the most scared is what happened in the next 3 hours. But before we get to that, we managed to get the boat up to Oban, and by which time I was mentally and physically wrecked. Now, the widow had told me that the harbour master in Oban knew the boat, knew Mr. Thompson's boat, and I would need to tell him that I'd bought the boat, and I would be looked after. I'd be, he'd look after me, which was great. So I sailed into Oban, feeling as though I'd just sailed around the world. And the plan was to go into Oban to get something to eat. And I put the boat to the side, tied it up, left plenty of slack on the ropes for the tide. And I felt so tired. I just literally I couldn't be bothered to go into Oban to get something to eat. All I wanted to do was sleep. So I pulled the dinghy aboard from the back, put it onto the boat, and the weather was dry, so I crawled into the dinghy and fell fast asleep almost immediately. Well, the next thing I knew, there was huge clanging noises, really banging, and car and lorry engines revving up, and I looked up and I saw there was a gantry across. The Caledonia McBrain ferry had come into the dock and reversed right up to where I was moored by the wall. Obviously it hadn't seen me, and there wasn't really that much space between the stern of that boat and the side of my little boat, but it had backed up to the wall, dropped these huge ramps down, which was the clanging, that was the thing that woke me up. And I woke up to lorries and buses and cars and all sorts of things passing over the top of me. And I couldn't move. I couldn't get to the ladder. I couldn't get off the boat. I just had to sit there and wait. And that's when I started feeling as though maybe I'd bitten off a bit more than I could chew. This was maybe crazy, but anyway, we survived that, and the boat got loaded up with cars again, and it head off. And there was no damage except for my pride and a few people who were passing comments to me as though to say, "What the hell are you doing there, you fool?" But there's no great damage done then. So after a really good sound sleep, bobbing about in the harbour tied to the wall, I woke up in the morning about 5 o'clock, quite keen to get up the Loch Linney, which is about a 23-mile loch, and it starts at Mull at the bottom. You've got the Sound of Mull, the island of Mull, and you've got Lismore, which is about 7 miles out from Oban. But in the morning I couldn't see Lismore, and it's normally visible right from the port of Oban. But anyway, we set off and into the mist, and I had a compass, so I'd gone for an hour and a half, and I'm starting to think, and I think I'm going to be halfway to America if I don't, if things don't sort of sweeten up a little bit. But fortunately the sun came out and it started to burn the mist off, and I saw the tip of Lismore, which was, what a relief, absolute relief. So I was told to take the left side of Lismore, not the right side full of rocks. The left side of Lismore, it's a clear run all the way to Fort William, which is 24 miles. So I set off, and I started feeling confident, getting a little bit too cocky and thinking, oh, this is great, if the engine works fine, we'll get there. And I made myself some coffee and had some sandwiches while I was on the boat, feeling the hardened fisherman. And we got up to a place, it's called the Corry Narrows. Now this only happens very, very rarely, but it happened on this day. And that's when the tide and the wind are against each other at the strongest point of the tide. And I happened to hit it spot on. I'm sailing along, and I could see this loch going from a few miles wide right down to a couple of 100 yards narrow, which is why it's called the Corry Narrows. So I'm heading towards the lighthouse, towards the Narrows, and I'm thinking, oh, well, I know there's going to be a lot of speed because of the push of the current, but what I wasn't prepared for, when I looked over the stern at the back, there was a wall of water, and I won't give you an exact figure because it's difficult to imagine. It'd have been anywhere between 12 and 20 feet, a wave that was catching me fast. It was really coming fast, and I thought my days had finished. But what I did when it arrived at the boat, I just grabbed onto the boat and prayed, because I cannot swim. And it lifted the boat into the air, and the boat dropped. And I saw this wave just go down, and I went up a hell of a height, and I came down again. And I thought, wow, you know, I survived that. That was good, you know, the adrenaline was pumping, you know. I had to keep the boat straight, because if I'd gone to the side, I'd have flipped over. But just as I was feeling relief, I looked, and there was another one. So what happens, you get about 5 or 6 of these big waves coming, you know, any one time. And I suffered the 5 or 6 waves, and I went through the Narrows like a speedboat past the lighthouse. Went so I got into the lock, and I was shaking all over me. I was trembling. I was thinking, I'm going to sell this damn thing. I'm not gonna be bothered with bloody boats. It's crazy, but. From just inside through the Narrows, I could see my house right at the end of the loch, about 10 mile away. And I thought, at least I'm home, and I'm in a small loch now. It's the same loch, but it's much, much smaller, 10 mile long, mile wide. This is a paddling pool, you know. It's not dangerous at all. So I sailed up to the shore, and as I'm approaching the shore, I really started to feel extremely tired. I think the adrenaline and the nerves had hit me so hard, I was just absolutely exhausted. So when I got to the shore, I couldn't think straight. I was really, really in a sad situation. So I stopped the engine, and I could see the house. The house was just up the beach, across the road, and there was the house. And I thought, I'm just going to throw the anchor out and get in my dinghy and go ashore, and I'm going to have a bath, I'm going to have a shower, and then I'm going to bed. And the boat can look after itself, it'll be okay. So I did that. I threw the anchor out, jumped into the dinghy, being completely inexperienced. Jumped in the dinghy, rowed ashore, tied the dinghy to a rock on the beach, walked into the house, had my shower, went to bed, and when I woke up in the following morning, because I slept all the time right through the night as well, I saw the boat had been washed up on a big tide, and it wasn't quite on the road, but it was almost on the road. And that's when I decided, no, fishing's not for me. But it's a drug. It's something that once it gets into the blood, it's extremely difficult not to have a boat. And I had 9, and I've got other stories that I can tell you about some of the other boats if you're interested in listening to them. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.